Since the time of Aristotle, metaphysics has been an ill-defined term. This paper defines it as a logically idempotent metalinguistic identity of reality, which couples the two initial ingredients of awareness, perceptual reality, the basis of physics, and cognitive perceptual syntax, a formalization of mind.
And today we look at the structure and dynamics of this metalinguistic identity of reality.
The maximal generality, universality, comprehensiveness criterion of a reality theoretic identity, or ontologically necessary and sufficient theory of everything, means that a fully general formal structure must be selected as the skeletal identity or toe framework of reality. This structure is distributive by definition, applying hologically to every point and part of reality. Conversely, because this structure represents the entirety of the ontologically self-contained system from which it is induced, it is the ontic identity of that system.
The axioms of the real numbers, since they are the universal, comprehensive identity of those numbers, they are distributed everywhere. In every part of the system of the real numbers, the axioms are satisfied. Hologically, the structure distributes to it. So that's the relation of the global identity to the part, and then the relation of the part to the global identity is that the part is represented by the overall identity. It's the overall identity is the ontic identity of the system. So the axioms of the real numbers are the ontic identity of the system of real numbers, meaning each part of the real numbers contain these axioms in terms of the structure that the part responds to, and the system, although there are many variants of numbers, there are many kind of particular numbers, they are all represented by this R, which represents the structure that is satisfied by all of them. And so in a similar way, when we think of the identity of reality, then we have an even broader maximum generality of the system, so a maximal structure that distributes over every point or part of reality. So we need to have an understanding of reality as something on which can be distributed a structure. Because of that structure, then all of those elements belong to this shared domain, which is a domain of reality. And then this structure that is distributed everywhere becomes the ontic identity of that system. So the structure is induced, just as for the numbers, we don't start from the axioms, but in the history of thoughts, we conceive of numbers, integers, and so on. We conceive of numbers in a very elementary way, and then we induce the structure of the axioms of the real numbers. In the same way, within the system of reality, we induce the structure that is valid within reality itself. And then this structure, because it's general, every part of reality responds to that structure. They're all part of a whole. And so there is a maximally general identity that creates a cohesion between every part of reality. This maximally general identity becomes the ontic identity of that system, becomes that which is distributed everywhere and that represents every aspect of reality. Reality is maximally general. It is universal. Every point, every distinction within reality belongs to that, and comprehensive in the sense that all the syntax that identifies reality is included in the general synetic syntax, the uniform syntax that is applying to every part of reality.
Reality is formulated in mathematical terms and mathematical structures, along with the various cognitive and perceptual structures they describe, can be scientifically formalized only as languages. Even the theory of languages is itself a language. This rule applies without exception, covering all quantitative equations and/or master equations purporting to describe reality. They, too, are languages. Formalistic and meaningless without embedment in a toe metalanguage, formulated as an overall description of reality. It follows that the toe identity must incorporate not only syndiphionic structure, but the formal structure of a language, refined to whatever degree may be necessary. As always, the structure of the language and syntactic and semantic consistency is preserved by its model theoretic mapping onto and into its universe. which means that the universe shares the linguistic structure and dynamics of the theory and is therefore also a language.
So the theory identity must incorporate the syntactic structure because it is the link between the discernible and the syntax that captures the relation between the different discernibles. So reality as this relationship of all that exists expresses a syntactic structure. It expresses the syntactic structure between the subjective and objective, between the syntax and the object responding to that syntax. But it also expresses a linguistic aspect. So the identity of reality, the structure that is distributed in every part of reality, has a linguistic aspect. Why? Because reality is formulated in mathematical terms. Mathematics is a language through which is described the structure of the components of reality, of the structure of the dynamics of the components of reality. And these structures, with cognitive and perceptual structures that they describe, they are formalized as languages, meaning all the structures that we use to break down reality and to clarify what are the relationships holding, what are the mapping holding between the components of reality that explain what things are, how they are classified, how they evolve. Those theories always come up as a language, as a paper that describes a language that corresponds to the thing described within reality. And if a language becomes this sort of independent thing because the theory of language is itself a language. When you want to formalize what is a language, what is syntax, what is a grammar, what is a sentence, and then a production that leads to terms, words that leads to meaning. All of this is also described through a language. You use a language to describe how all of this works. So there's sort of this independence of language, independence of the explanation of language in terms of language. All the master equations of the model of physics, they also come up as languages with entities, with relations holding between these entities, with parameters that can be evaluated through logic and mathematical content that is described through languages. So languages becomes this abstract, general algebraic structure that is tied to every scientific identification of reality, that is behind every description of reality, and that is behind all the cognitive perceptual content of the scientist, of the observer. And so this syntactic structure that we assumed is part of this identity of reality, because reality is this syntactic relationship, this glue holding and dualizing the diffeonic content, the diffeonic objective aspect, and the synetic subjective, the synetic relationships holding between the content. This whole of reality, this unity, reality being the unity, and this variegated part. All of this is tied together by syntactic structure that has also a linguistic structure. And again, this theory identity must distribute by homology in every part of reality, because reality is this maximally general structure, maximally general identity. And now we're talking about the meta language. So it remains a language, but it applies on top of the language, the structure of language itself, beyond the, let's say, the obvious language that structures all the structure and dynamics of reality. There is a meta language that is a language that structures all of these languages that apply and that deploy themselves in terms of the evolution of reality. There has to be, so the syntax and the semantic consistency, so the meaning you extract from this particular pattern that follow that syntax, they can only be preserved within reality because the universe that responds to that language is expressed in terms of this linguistic structure itself. It doesn't, the universe and the model preserve this syntax and these networks of meaning applying onto the syntax. And so the model map onto the universe, meaning you can take the universe and all the components of them are like letters that fit nicely into this model, into this alphabet of the model, and that is able to be read, but also into its universe, meaning the model becomes part of the universe. And so there's this linguistic structure and dynamics of the theory, because all the theories are expressed in terms of language. In order for the universe to map, to correspond exactly to the theory, in order to be the universe to be identified with the theory, it inherits this linguistic structure of the theory, And so the universe inherit of the structure and dynamics of a language. And in the real numbers, you have that as well to some extent, where all the models of the real numbers map to the theory of the complete ordered field, which is a logical set of axioms that are satisfied by the real numbers. And so you can think of the numbers directly if you think of the theory. All the models map to the same theory. And so the universe, the numbers themselves are directly captured by the theory as well. There is this tight mapping where if you pick a number, you can understand it through the theory, the complete ordered field, and all the models of the numbers map back to this complete ordered field. And so when you think of the universe of numbers, you don't think there's this universe somewhere, and then I have this model of them as a complete ordered field. The distinction breaks down because all the model of the numbers come back to this exact structure. And so you can, by thinking of that structure, you think of the universe of the real numbers directly. You're not looking for, there's nothing else than these axioms behind the real numbers. Directly you have it. And so when I present the mathematical trinity, I present numbers through this axiomatic lens, meaning the universe itself is made of these axioms that are carried, in my case, by these three primary numbers, 0, 1, and plus infinity. But there's nothing behind that. There's no landscape where you observe numbers and then you try to model them with your theory that doesn't really match. The theory itself is the numbers. The mathematician induce the rules of numbers, and then there's nothing behind those rules to define what is a real number. And so when you talk about real numbers, you're talking about these axioms directly. You're talking about the theory of the real numbers. And that's the universe that is totally defined by the theory. So the theory distributes over the real numbers, and that's sort of how they come about. There's no landscape in which you chase those real numbers. And that comes from the fact that there is a unique, all models of real numbers are uniquely defined by isomorphism to this structure of the complete ordered field. So there's a tight correspondence between the universe, the model, and the theory for the real numbers. And that's also the case here. That's what's proposed here. There has to be, to preserve the theory of reality, you have to have the universe that correspond to this linguistic structures. And so you have the isomorphism between the linguistic structure of the theory and the linguistic structure of the universe. And again, it comes back to this maximal generality, because it's not like there's something behind that theory of reality that would be left unexplained by the theory of reality. Because it's a maximally general identity of reality, we assume, we define it as such as there's nothing behind. We induce the thing for which by definition there is nothing left behind. And so the theory itself that we define, that's this maximally general theory that has a linguistic structure, maps onto and into the universe of the theory. It's the same thing as saying the numbers, they're not defined as the stars in the sky and we count them, and now we have a model that, say now we have the piano axioms. Instead we say the numbers are the object that satisfies the piano axioms. And in the case of the real numbers is specifically the structure of the complete ordered field. Here, we don't say that the structure is the same as the universe, but we say that the linguistic aspect maps into the universe as well, which becomes linguistic. You had the same thing with Kant, where in order for the perception to correspond to the understanding, you had to have a similar structure, which was through the schemes. There was a specific understanding of how the structure of space and time through sequences was able to reproduce the logic categories of the understanding. So causation is a succession of time, for example, and so the perception becomes mapped within the cognition through those schemas of Kant. And so here we have much more general statement, which is theories are linguistic, and the universe that is described by the theory must also be linguistic, because it preserves the syntactic and semantic consistency of reality by this mapping onto and into the universe. For the real numbers, a close property to that is the fact that in second order logic, real numbers are categorical, meaning any model of the real numbers is isomorphic to this single expression of the theory of numbers which is the theory of the complete ordered field. For reality, we're saying that the universe shares the structure of the ontic identity of reality.
Language is often mistakenly conceived as the opposite of mathematics. It is thought to be structurally loose and semantically nebulous, whereas mathematics is thought to be tight, clear, and unequivocal. In fact, not only is language a mathematical structure in its own right, but it is the most general mathematical structure of all, subsuming every other. If language were not mathematical in every sense, and if it were not capable of concise and unequivocal expression, then not only would mathematics, and therefore mathematical physics, be inadequate to characterize reality, but there would be no such things as mathematics and physics at all.
So here we dispel maybe a naive conception of language, which stems from the idea that language is the domain of literature, of maybe poetry, and mathematics would be the domain of the tight, clear, of the equations, of the numbers, of the exact. We dispel that by saying that both literature and mathematics are expressed in language, and so the algebraic structure of language is able to have this tight, clear precision, unequivocal, that is expressed through the fields of mathematics and physics, and it also can express the more structurally loose, contextual, poetic, semantically nebulous, semantically ambiguous, sometimes by definition, by construction. So language is not something that's looser than mathematics. It is something that is at the foundation of both mathematics and the literary language. So we're not suggesting that reality is not at all science. There's no physics. It's all about, very loose sense of language. Language, even logos, all these notions of languages, they are the very core of expressibility, of modeling, of theory, physical, mathematical, or otherwise. So when we say that the theory is a language, we're not denying the mathematical structure that are implicated in the proper description of the structure and dynamics of reality. We're just positioning this precise mathematical understanding of the structure and evolution within this broader, more expressive, more comprehensive, more maximally general structure, which is the structure of language.
However, reality is not just a language. It is a very special kind of language which possesses properties never before seen in a language outside the work of this author. These are the properties without which the mathematical structure of language cannot serve as the structure of reality, and without which reality theory would be futile. It would be futile because the word theory is just an abbreviation of theoretic language, and any theory at all must impute its own linguistic structure to reality as its content, and in the case of a toe, as its form and content alike.
So when we say reality is language, we don't mean naive notion of language, such as something spoken by somebody. Reality is not just my language. It's not just your language. It's a specific language that contains both my language, your language, and all the language of science, all the language of the mathematical physical structure. And it is not just a language in terms of an automaton that would just recognize something. So it's not saying that the universe is a giant computer that just processes a language, which are sort of naive ways to define languages. Because it's a theory, the language has to explain the automaton itself, but has to explain as well the speaker of the language itself. So it has to be this much broader language that contains both natural languages, automaton, mathematical structure, and that allows all of these elements to play out together and to impact reality. So when we say theory, and again, remind that it's theoretic language, and so any theory must impute its own linguistic structure to reality as its content. So when Einstein says E equal mc squared, he imputes the fact that these structures, these quantities, and this equation is satisfied by reality. So reality, which is made of all of our perceptions, all of the objects that generate those perceptions, and so on, would satisfy this linguistic structure, would preserve this E equals mc squared, right? So when you have a theory, you assume that the content of the universe satisfy the linguistic structure of the theory. And when we have a maximally general theory, maximally general identity, so a T or E, then you assume that the linguistic pertains not only to the content, but even to the form, even to the processing, even to the placeholder that awaits content. So the theory, if it's supposed to explain the structure and the process and everything that can be identified or induced within reality, then it represents both the form and the content of the reality you describe. And because the object that is being described is maximally general, so the reality overall, then the theory of language which describe this must impute its own internal linguistic structure that is used to describe, to theorize about reality. You must impute it as something that is followed by reality. And so the form and the content of reality gain the shape of this identity of reality through which we identify reality. So when we say that it's a language, it has to be a language that sustains reality as we see overall. So it's a language that contains all the syntax that is available to the human cognitive perceptual syntax, qualias, space-time object, logical mathematical syntax, emotilik syntax, or everything that has to do with the evaluation of utility, with potentially emotions. So all of this has to be included within the linguistic structure that we mean when we mean that reality is a language. Since it's a maximally general language, it has to be linguistic on all the different aspects. And so we go beyond the naive understanding of language as just this channel of communication or as just this something recognized by a system that implements without language something. No, everything becomes linguistic. Reality becomes this language. So there's this meta language, which is the theory of what holds together all of these languages that explain the evolution of reality. It has to explain the emergence of sub-languages within the theory. It has to explain the compatibility between the physical languages that explains some of the events prior to the emergence of people, and then how people use language afterward. We don't explain reality as just a language of people. We explain reality as this proto-computational language that would explain the emergence of both the physical laws and then the emergence of agents within reality that use their own language to describe it, to induce the theory of reality overall. It all has to be contained in this very special kind of language that is maximally general. But that keeps the structure of language because we induce the structure within a structure of intelligibility that always take a linguistic structure. Linguistic structures that also corresponds to every theory, every cognitive and perceptual syntax that we extract from reality are within the domain of the linguistic. And so this global identity of reality that we want to induce, the global structure that is everywhere part of reality, also inherit this linguistic structure. So it is just not the structure of the real, it is the linguistic structure of reality. And so forms and content of reality inherit of this linguistic structure of the theory, which is the only form that can be induced within theory. And we expect to have this structure available because there is reality tied together into this syntophionic maximal relationship, and that gain this linguistic structure just by the way syntax and semantic cover the content conceived or perceived within reality. This language, logos, in the beginning was the word. It's this kind of word. It's the word that contains the universe, the word that contains all the meaning, all the structure, all the dynamics. It is that kind of language. And that kind of language that deploys itself through all the theories that we have, through the perception that we can classify as positively perceived, yes or no. Anything that falls beyond those languages, fall beyond the scope of theorization, scope beyond of what is the identity of reality. That's a big proposal of the CTMU, that languages cover reality, and it's hard to escape because all of the reality that go beyond the language would not have any structure to tie it to the coherent and consistent domain of the real. it is not to say that every aspect of reality is tight, clear, and precise in the sense that all the indecisible, all the emotions, all the concepts can now be displayed in terms of mathematics, but the syntax overall that ties together all this more nebulous or loose language and this precise language has a linguistic structure by the fact that it is everywhere distributed as the universally inducible theory that reflects the identity of the system, and by this fact inherit the linguistic structure of any theoretical language that can be used to cover such reality.
Dynamically, the most interesting feature of the Toemaster language is that it evolves in two orthogonal directions. One mode of evolution occurs in the familiar linear read-write direction. For users of the English language, this is horizontally from left to right. Well, we ignore the downward succession of lines on a page. The important thing is that each line is written and read from left to right. The other, which occurs in the perpendicular direction, can be variously exemplified as 1. A mathematical calculation or axiomatic derivation, in which one starts at the top of a page with a horizontally written initial statement and uses axioms and rules of inference to work downward through a series of modified statements, finally terminating on the bottom line or conclusion. 2. A cellular automaton, which begins as a horizontal line of contiguous colored squares or cells, and evolves downward line by line as chromatic transformation rules are applied to the cells of each line in succession. And 3, a grammatical derivation in which, by a series of substitutions, a start symbol evolves through a derivational series of non-terminal expressions to a communicable terminal expression.
So the ontic identity of reality has the structure of a language, and so it implies that there are different modes of evolution to this ontic identity of reality. And so one mode of evolution is just the mode of reading from left to right in the case of English, but in any language, the order with which the language maybe is just read in a spoken way. So there is this linear language where each component, each word, each symbol occurs one after the other, and together they form a network of semantic. But because the language is not restricted to this read-write direction, there is also different modes. One mode would be, for example, starting with two numbers a and b greater than 0. And then because a and b are real numbers, you can apply axioms. And so you can derive rules of inference. And at the bottom of the conclusion, you say a greater than 0, b greater than 0. Then a times b is greater than 0. It's the compatibility of the order with multiplication. So you have an initial statement, and then you have axioms and rules of inference based on those axioms that you can use to derive statements. And so you arrive at the final statement. So it's a perpendicular evolution. It outputs a linear read-write direction statement, which is just a greater than 0, b greater than 0. Therefore, a times b greater than 0. In the middle, you've had all these components that played a role in converging to that statement. Another case of perpendicular evolution is you can imagine just cells with colors, which represent a timeline. You can read right from left to right these colors, but it evolves by transformation rules depending on the patterns that are on this line. The full line evolves chromatically with this cellular automaton. So you sort of have a fixed array and it gets transformed perpendicularly, but you still have this sense of left to right. And finally, you have grammatical derivation, in which you start with the start symbol, the sentence, then you apply productions to derive some valid non-terminal expressions that can be derived from the start symbol. And then from these non-terminal expressions, you can derive further valid substitutions to non-terminal or terminal expressions. And through a series of grammatical productions, you arrive at a full sentence made of terminal symbols. So a sentence can be subject, verb, and direct object. It's one of the possible production of the general notion of sentence. And then you can particularize the subject, verb, and direct object into I learn mathematical metaphysics. And so you can substitute this start symbol sentence into this non-terminal subject, verb, and direct object. And then you can substitute subject with I, the verb with learn, and the direct object with the noun phrase that you then substitute to mathematical metaphysics. So you start from sentence, and by a series of productions and replacing with either non-terminals or terminals, you end up with I learn mathematical metaphysics. So through grammatical derivation, you arrive at a left to right linear read-write direction with this perpendicular process of replacing the start symbol. You arrive at this linear read-write direction where you just end up with the sentence, I learn mathematical metaphysics. And these directions are two orthogonal directions, with sort of the linear read-write being to some extent an output of the perpendicular direction, but is also just a general evolution that is proper to all of this perpendicular direction as well. They're sort of expected output or patterns that interact with this perpendicular. So you have these two directions of evolution that not only generate the linear read-write direction, we end up with a sentence, we end up with a specific, cellular automaton, a specific chromatic range of cells, we end up with a specific mathematical statement or a specific sentence, but it also evolves and produces specific cognitive dynamic structures that transform sentence. So not only do you produce terminal expressions, but you also produce non-terminal expressions along the way that remain as parameters that will make the system evolve both in terms of the layer of perpendicular evolution, but also as the layer of linear read-write direction. And this speaks to the idea of the CTMU, which assesses that time is not an evolution from left to right, from past to future. It's not just a connection of space-time events in a network of space-time events, but it is a processing of both the terminal expressions that emerge as in the form of space-time events, but also an evolution of the non-terminal grammar that is designing the universe, is designing these non-terminal expressions, both the perpendicular evolution, but also the linear evolution, are being generated and are being identified as the system evolves. So the universe is both this approximately linear evolution of the universe with events that gets written from past to future, but it's also the definition of the different components, which in the language, in the form of grammatical derivation, in the form of tellers of spatial objective within the universe, define the ingredients that coordinate the future into specific objective, and so that sort of work in direction from the future to the past, where the physical is sort of embedded in this linear read-write direction. The metaphysical is all the structure of reality that processes reality in sort of this metaphysical direction, and that allows the goals and the optimization of the self-utility of the system to get refined and defined in this metaphysical domain, which produces and which brings the self-determinacy required to fully determine the terminal expressions, where the terminal expressions have statistical indeterminacy in the realm of quantum physics, for example. This metaphysical, this perpendicular direction, all these ingredients that guide the self-utility of the system through this metaphysical layer, from this perpendicular processing layer, they're the components that bridge the gap of this indeterminacy and that fully explain the different components of the universe, and that allow to have an identity of reality that is not partial, assuming that there is some random dice generated outside of reality. Reality becomes this fully self-contained system because of these two things. And we do see the linear read-write direction, and I think Langan points that in the language, because reality is a language, there is this perpendicular direction as well that will explain how complex systems emerge from simpler system within the evolution of reality. And here we have three examples. So because the identity of reality, the ontic identity of reality, as a linguistic structure, it has both of these direction of evolution.
As a language couples to its content on the syntactic and semantic levels, orthogonal evolutionary processes analogous to those of the language are induced in the content. Where the content of the language is an appropriately structured manifold, the manifold in question also evolves in two orthogonal dimensions. One of these dimensions is the terminal dimension. This dimension is timelike in the sense that it takes time to read or write a horizontal line of print, with read and write being timelike processes. The vertical space-like dimension is then correspondent to axiomatic or grammatical derivation, comprising an orthogonal dimension of causation with orthogonal sequences of pregeometric non-terminals, where the manifold is spatiotemporal, and the terminal dimension of its evolution is understood as timelike, causal, and physical. The grammatical dimension of evolution is metacausal, metatemporal, and metaphysical. It coherently transforms entire spatio-temporally extended systems rather than local states. It is not subject to local confinement, as is terminal causation, which consists of many separate threads, but has non-local coherence and combinatorial, relational, and operational degrees of freedom, which let it take the physical states of spatio-temporally extended systems as input and yield extended complexes of physical events as metasimultaneous output, where metasimultaneous means occurring within the same null grammatical process.
And since the theoretic model maps onto and into the universe, then these two directions of evolution, these two orthogonal processes, map into the content, into the universe. And so you have actually two orthogonal dimensions. When we structure the manifold to reflect the identity of reality, so to reflect these two dimensions, we have the two processes of processing of language that occur within the universe. And so here we extend the understanding of these two orthogonal processes with what it represents in the universe, in the content of the identity of reality. You have the terminal dimension, which is this read-write evolution, which is timelike, causal, and physical. It's this network of space-time events with terminal expressions. But you also have this vertical space-like dimension of causations, which here he calls pre-geometric non-terminals. They are not within the geometrical network which separates events and which connects them in sort of this left to right. And obviously, it's not only left to right, but it's just a sequence of events which do occur with the constraint of geometry. So the left to right is understood as this physical, time-like physical causal structure, which reflects in all the local constraints of evolution. It's constrained because it goes from one letter to the other, from one space-time event to the other, with these local confinements of the information, of the possibility of evolution, with this event that has to carry outward with the speed of light, right? That constrains the ability for system to interact with each other. There's sort of this geometry that creates this possibility of events which go from left to right, which is not reversible, which gives an ordering of the different events through space-time. And the property of those is that they represent these local states which have local confinement and terminal causation, which means like they sort of occur and then they become input to other events, but they don't by themselves represent a vector of causation that remains to be specified. Like the event happens. The physical event becomes identified, and sort of once this physical event occurs, then it's part of the local chains of causality of these events. So that's how we understand this left to right timelike evolution, linguistic evolution, when we think of it in terms of the evolution within reality. And so then the other dimension becomes this metacausal, metatemporal, and metaphysical, and it would transform not local events, but it sort of looks above these local events and sees them as separate threads of events that are locally relevant to each other. But reality as a whole is sort of this synthyphonic relationship. So all these diffionic elements, they are tied together with this synetic aspect of the synthyphonic relationship. And so you have this relationship which extends beyond these local constraints. And so spatio-temporally extended systems is sort of the thing that is transformed by this vertical direction of processing of the ontic identity of reality. And so it becomes metacausal, metaphysical, metatemporal, because it transforms all these grid, all these network of spatio-temporally extended systems, and brings non-local coherence and ability to evolve, to create networks of meaning, relational networks, and operational evolution of the system in a global way, non-local way. And so with degrees of freedom, it would be like a grammatical derivation. It would be like an axiomatic derivation. And these outputs are meta-simultaneous because they take into account all these spatially temporally extended systems, meaning at different times, different space, different objects, different systems that feed to this linguistic processing their structure and the states. This linguistic vertical processing sees as a coherent input and applies transformation with some degrees of freedom of this transformation that yields other complexes of physical events, that yields other ingredients that transform the system in this vertical direction. At any point, the terminal events are just this network of word of stories, and it's just not one book, but it's a collection of books that get written in parallel that all have constraints, right? Each book needs to make sense locally, make sense globally because they're coherent. They're part of the coherent collection of books. So they sort of connect to each other, they relate to each other, maybe they refer to the same characters, and each book must relate to everything that's been written within the book. But the grammar, which is just this start symbol, which gets expanded grammatically into non-terminals that write all of this book, that write all of this terminal section of those books, all the beginning, maybe even it writes the beginning and some part of the middle, and maybe even it has some predicted end as well. But all those books get written in parallel. So all those books, they're like locally confined grammatical process, and you can see the linear read-write operation, but it's meta-simultaneous because as these books get written, it's always within the same start symbol that is writing all of these books, that always keep this terminal and always this evolution of these non-terminals that keep writing those books. And in that way, from the standpoint of the language, it is just one process, which is not split between different times, so where there would be different events, but it's all one grammatical time, the time of the start symbol that is being written with productions to all of these spatio-temporal extended system, all of these different books that write what's inside them and that have this global coherence. So you can imagine that the page are not truly separate, but that you could merge books together and get some insight from that and use that to define the next portion of the book that is being written or the story that is being written. So there's this story being written, and it's not in just the language of stories. It has this spatio-temporal aspect. That's why we talk about, different threads of processing, and then this pre-geometric non-local coherence and ability to combine operations between those elements. So we're a bit more abstract. We yield spatio-temporally extended systems, extended complexes of physical events, which could be as abstract as defining the collapse of a quantum wave function as the coordination of a desired output of a non-terminal entity within the system. So it's as abstract as this, but essentially because language has these two dimensions, and because reality is described through the form of a language, the universe itself inherits these modes of evolution, and so inherits these processes that define the language. So when we have this basis of reality, when we have this perceptual reality, all these objects in space-time, and when you have the cognitive perceptual syntax that aggregates, that creates significant relations within that, then you infer the structure that this linguistic identity takes on reality. So we induce the structure from the basic components of reality, the objective, let's say, and the subjective, which reflect the physical, and the cognitive perceptual syntax, the structured applied to the perceptual. So when we have these two domains and you start to map them to this object, which is the theoretical language that describes reality, the theoretical language that provides the identity of reality, that is the form that it takes. But it takes so because it's trying to shape what kind of object is the structure that is everywhere distributed and that reflects the ontic identity of your system. So it's the induction of this mathematical metaphysics based on considerations of what the mapping has to be. It has to be a linguistic mapping. It has to be a theoretical language to preserve the syntactic and semantic consistency of reality with the identity of reality. The universe has to exhibit this linguistic syntax. And so this linguistic syntax has direction of read and write, but it has, maybe even more importantly, this vertical direction of grammatical derivation. And so it exhibits the fact that the universe and how we apply the identity of reality, we go beyond this causal timelike physical network of events and have to think of it as transforming entire spatial-temporal extended systems into these extended complexes of physical events. So that's sort of the steps to arrive here. And we arrive at the notion where the evolution, in one way, it is meta-simultaneous. In one way, it is space-like. It happens in one meta instant, which is the derivation of the grammar. So when we say the sentence, I learn mathematical metaphysics, in one way, it has a timelike causal component where each word follows another with a specific rule. In another way, it's just a meta-simultaneous sentence. It's just simultaneous in the sense that it's just one piece of syntax of meaning occurring within the same grammatical process that derived this sentence. And so reality as a whole, if we think about the structure that is distributed in every part of reality, in the same way we think of it as a meta-simultaneous structure, in the sense that the processes that transform that structure, that create the evolution, are meta-simultaneous, contained in one grammatical derivation due to the linguistic form that the ontic identity of reality takes.
Metacausation and other metaphysical criteria require that the standard physical conception of space-time be superseded by a more advanced metaphysical conceptualization that is logico-geometrically dual to the linguistic structure of the triadic identity. Called the conspansive manifold, it is self-generative and requires 3 levels of topology and 3 corresponding levels of quantization. A conspansive manifold is dynamically self-contained. In coupling with the linguistic identity, it evolves by generative self-modeling, embedding conventional spacetime as a linear ectomorphic semi-model corresponding to the semilanguage LO of the toe identity.
So instead of thinking of the universe as something that happens in space-time, we need to propose a manifold that is compatible with this linguistic structure of this maximally general ontic identity of reality. And so the conspansive manifold dualize the logical geometric spacetime with the linguistic structure of the triadic identity of language, where you have the sign, the interpretant, and the object. So the triadic linguistic identity of the universe as a language is dualized to this logical geometric understanding of spacetime in this conspansive manifold. And this ties to the fact that this linguistic understanding of this identity of reality maps syntactically and semantically to reality, because the universe corresponds to that linguistic structure. And so you need to have the universe not thought as this thing that happens in space-time, but this thing that happens within this conspansive manifold that allows for these two orthogonal evolutions to happen, this linear read-write evolution, as well as this vertical grammatical transformation of the manifold. These two orthogonal evolutions that stem from the linguistic nature of ultimately the universe of the identity of reality have to happen within an appropriate manifold, which is here clarified to be this conspansive manifold. This conspansive manifold is self-generative, so it will be self-modeling. And here we announce that this conspansive manifold relies on 3 levels of topology and 3 levels of quantization, which are the different kind of scope, causal power of the different points of this manifold, where each point is a syntactor that processes syntax, so that is something that processes language, so that can satisfy this globally distributed identity of reality, which is this linguistic identity distributed on every part of reality. So every part of reality become points of this conspansive manifold. And so these points have at least 3 levels of topology related to the possibility of the operations within the conspansive manifold. The conspansive manifold is this manifold that will support this idempotence, self-contained. It is the manifold that corresponds to this maximally general theory, universal, comprehensive. So it is self-contained. It is not something within a broader domain. It is the domain of reality on which we want to describe the ontic identity of reality. So we understand reality as this conspansive manifold, and self-contained means self-modeling. There's self-perception, self-cognition, so self-modeling. And this manifold embeds the space-time with which we understand reality as geometric in the form of the semi-language. So just as a language has this linear read-write operation, here we have this linear ectomorphic semi-model, which corresponds to the conventional understanding of space-time. So this conventional understanding of space-time, which is just a linear read-write, is we augment it with this metacausal, metatemporal, metaphysical processes within this conspansive manifold, and we keep this conventional understanding of space-time, but as one semi-language LO of this global identity that reflects reality. So there's this other semi-language that will reflect the full scope of operations that reality takes during its evolution, during its modelization. And so the identity of reality goes beyond this physical conception of space-time. It is superseded with this notion of evolution, which correspond to a new understanding of the manifold of reality, of what reality is, that comes with the constraint of the levels of topology that we find in this manifold, that can be used to classify objects within reality, and that can be used to point to the operation that occur within these different levels of quantization. And the conventional space-time is not just rejected by this theory, but it is just thought as this linear left to right direction that has to be complemented with this metatemporal, metaphysical evolution that occurs in a broader language, and in which all the events of the universe are meta-simultaneous, which means occurring within the same grammatical process. And so we have clarified the structure and the dynamics of this metalinguistic identity of reality. The structure is reflected by the manifold that contains the universe of this metalinguistic identity of reality, and that reflects the two orthogonal evolutionary process, where the traditional understanding of the embedding space of reality, this embedding conventional space-time, is just one semi-model, one semi-language, LO, that is coupled with this linguistic structure of the triadic identity of the language, which transforms these spatio-temporally extended systems into complexes of physical events and so that provides ground for non-local coherence. Reality is coherent despite the local threads, local geometrical constraints. There is this pre-geometric structure that is distributed everywhere that provides reality with a coherent way to identify itself, with a universal and comprehensive way to identify all of its structure, even despite the local processes that sort of split reality in separate threads. All the threads are part of the same global programming with this linguistic structure, which not only contain the precise mathematical structures that can be involved as invariant within the semi-language LO, but all of the structures that reflect all the different points of reality, points of which we are an instance. So all of the structure of the human cognitive perceptual syntax is also reflected in this conspansive manifold, which allows to think of the overall linguistic coherence dualized to the logical geometric that is preserved within the identity of reality, a system that is induced from the perceptual reality and from the cognitive perceptual syntax, by which we derive the form that takes this globally distributed coupling of intention and extension. This identity is not only synthiphonic, coupling the intention and the extension in one synthiphonic relationship, but it's also a language. And so it carries the structure of this processing with the dynamics of the language that get embedded in how we think about the universe and about the identity, the ontic identity of the universe, that is the object maximally universal, comprehensive, that distribute over the content that is understood as the universe processed by this induced model. A lot of the properties of this conspansive manifold with 3 levels of topology, 3 corresponding levels of quantization, the fact that it is generative, are all components that are posing an induction, so inducing this model, posing the frame that will be further explained, further elucidated throughout this document, but that all participate to this induction of the general model within the conspansive manifold. So as points of the conspansive manifold, we'll be inducing the overall structure, again from the basis of what we have available, which is the physical reality, which has all this logical geometric structure that we summarize here with this semi-language LO, but also that has to have sort of this overall structure of being self-contained, so universal, containing all of its structure and dynamics, self-modeling, and that has this linguistic operations that provide ground for the overall evolution and how the universe sustains its own linear evolution. It sustains that because it has this metatemporal, metaphysical, metacausal processes that are occurring within the identity of reality that allows to have some self-definition of the evolution of reality within this system. And we derive that from the linguistic nature by which we are able to provide cognitive syntax that correspond to reality, to our perceptual reality. By inducing the model of that, we identify the linguistic nature of that, and so we identify that the universe that is described by this theoretical language has to also sustain the coherence with that language, and so has to provide these linguistic structures, to provide this conspansive metaphysical domain of operations, which allows for this vertical orthogonal processing.